So is it appropriate to apply Lean Six Sigma principles in a military setting? Let's talk about it. So earlier this week we started a discussion about, is it appropriate to apply Lean Six Sigma principles in a military setting? And this stemmed off of Luke High's article in Army Sustainment about the topic, and a lot of widespread opinions. Here's going to be my opinion. I'm just going to break it down using a simple construct. But first of all, my answer, very complex: yes, no, maybe. And here's what I mean. I'm going to go back to a very simple acronym that we've used for decades in the military, and we probably still use to examine and explore the nature of this question. METTC, which stands for Mission, Enemy, Time, Troops, and Civilian Considerations. But instead of civilian considerations, I'm going to use a different C today. So hang around and make sure you pick up on that one, because potentially that's the most important one. What I'm talking about is the answer, it depends. And the reason it depends is because the various variables that are at hand versus an established commercial supply chain where we know what these variables are and we have control over the change in these variables. That's really what this whole question comes down to. Do we understand the setting, and do we know a lot about the variables at hand so that we can control them? That's what Six Sigma is controlling variables to get optimum performance. So if we don't have a good sense of the variability and we don't feel like we can get a handle on controlling it, it probably isn't the setting to apply Six Sigma principles in. So let's tick this down. Let's come back to mission, because mission is going to come out throughout the rest of this discussion. Let's move on to enemy. Well, that's very simple. In a warfighting tactical scenario where we have enemy involved and enemy engagements, and it's early on in the engagement, we probably have a lot of variability that we don't know about, and therefore we can't seek to control it yet. So Six Sigma would probably not apply there. Now, in a motor pool, which is what Luke was talking about, we don't have an enemy there. The only enemy we have is probably ourselves, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. Let's talk about troops. This is a variable. So what are we talking about when we talk troops? Well, we're talking about the skill level of our troops to perform the task. We're also talking about the availability of troops. So again, let's talk about this motor pool setting. This is often a bone of contention, not having the troops available to perform equipment services, which I feel should be the cornerstone of any military maintenance program. You'll hear this a lot. First sergeant keeps taking my guys to perform taskings, and therefore I can't establish a base of people that are going to perform services and are going to get really good at it, which would lead us to applying Six Sigma principles. We shouldn't let that get in our way. But if it is really happening and we have different people each day to perform services, this is a problem, and this is going to impact performance. And so therefore, we may not want to invest in Six Sigma principles. Let's talk about time. Well, time, again, in that tactical warfighting scenario, time is a big variable, and it's probably not something we have control over. This is why we need services on the training schedule, because if they're not planned, they probably are less likely to happen. We also need to allocate the time that services are needed and also get the resources there. So if we're not willing to do that and we don't have an environment that facilitates us doing that, again, probably not appropriate to a Six Sigma approach. Terrain. I didn't talk about this much, but it's very, very important. In that tactical setting, we've got all sorts of variables that we still really don't understand. Namely, we've got roads. Think about Afghanistan, or lack of roads. Think about Iraq and us not knowing how long it's going to take us to get from A to B. We may have a general idea, but there's so many variables that could affect us in our ability to cross that route. The leading variable being weather. Again, back in that motor pool, we take a lot of these things away. We don't have terrain that we have to negotiate. Do we have the bays available or not to perform those services? But if we do have the bays, weather is not really a problem. So again, we can take more variables out of the mix and set conditions to really get down at this problem if we want to. Which leads us to our last consideration. Not civilian considerations, but our own culture. Personally, I feel that it could be done in a motor pool setting. You could apply Six Sigma principles to a service operation. Now, in Six Sigma, we want to measure performance, usually to a standard. A standard of manufacturing is where Six Sigma is often applied. But in a services setting, we could apply it to the amount of time that it takes us to produce a quality service, but more importantly, the amount of expected readiness that we intend to get out of that service, which currently isn't measured. Which leads me to my final set of points. The culture, our own culture, may not support launching Six Sigma efforts. We aren't data-driven by nature in the military. We're much more intuitive. And sometimes this works against us. It may be working against us as we examine this problem. It's just kind of not in our DNA to naturally measure these types of things. We want to get the job done and move on, as opposed to look at it a different way. So our own culture may actually prevent us from implementing Six Sigma in settings where it could work and it's more appropriate. So to recap, METTC, mission, enemy, troops, terrain, and time, and civilian considerations or culture may be a construct for you to evaluate and further examine the question if Six Sigma principles are appropriate to apply in military settings. But that's just what I think. You tell us what you think.